What's up everybody? Today I've got another Duskmourn Commander deck tech for you, featuring no one less than Winter Misanthropic Guide. Winter Misanthropic Guide is a kind of a unique commander, and I don't even know another commander that does the same thing as Winter at all. Winter has War 2 first of all, which is great for protection in Commander, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws 2 cards. So it's kind of also a group hug commander because all my opponents also get to draw the cards. And then we have a Delirium on this card, and the Delirium says as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, each opponent's maximum hand size is equal to 7 minus the number of those card types. So what does Winter's Delirium ability do? Well, it shrinks the hand size of our opponents, the maximum hand size I have to say. And in order for us to activate that Delirium, we need to have at least 4 different card types in our graveyard. And with card types, we mean lands, instants, sorceries, creatures, enchantments, artifacts, and planeswalkers. We only need 4, but we can go as high as 7, since we have all the different types in our deck. And when we do have all the 7, it means that the maximum hand size of our opponents will all be 0. So I've chosen to build Winter as a group hug commander. A lot of people will look at this deck list and probably say, well, that's not really group hug what you're playing. But hey, I'm just saying, I think it's group hug. I get to give my opponents a lot of cards. That's more you normally get from your opponents in Commander. So I'm just calling it out. That's group hug for me. The fact that we're going to punish them really hard for drawing those cards is something completely different. So how are we going to do this? We got a lot of card draw effects that let our opponents draw cards. We got a lot of pingers that will punish our opponents for drawing cards. We're going to let our opponents discard a lot of cards, and then we have a lot of cards that punish our opponents for discarding those cards. We've noticed that the majority of our viewers haven't subscribed yet, so please consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment down below. For this video, I would like to hear what kind of includes you guys still would like to see in this deck, and maybe what cards you don't like as much that I put in, because I'm always up for some feedback and to see like what you guys all come up with. So what archetype is Winter? Well, the way I've built it, I would classify it as a mix between tempo and control. The reason I say tempo as well is because if we're going to be really late with enabling our Delirium, our opponents might have just already have such a good board state that whatever we do with Winter doesn't even matter anymore. So we kind of want to tempo out here and get Delirium as fast as possible, and if we can do that and put our opponents on maybe 1 or 2 cards in hand very early, then in the late game we can play the control game where we'll just have abundance of cards compared to them. We have ways to remove their creatures, we have very powerful creatures ourselves, and yeah, then it'll be fun times. But we need to tempo and get Winter online as fast as possible if we want to make our strategy work. So let's take a look at the key cards in this deck. The key cards in this deck that I've chosen are cards that punish our opponents for discarding cards. Cards such as Bandit's Talent, which the first level says each opponent discards 2 cards unless they discard a non-land card. The second level says that at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer lands in hand, they lose 2 life. And then the third level says at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in hand. So basically all these effects will always happen once we've got like 4, 5, 6 or 7 cards, type of cards in the graveyard, which makes Bandit Talent just pop off on its own. Second card is Waste Not, which says whenever an opponent discards a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and whenever an opponent discards a land card, we add 2 black, and whenever an opponent discards a non-creature, non-land, we draw a card. So again, since we're making our opponent discard a lot, depending on what kind of card they discard, we will get something from Waste Not. And the last really key card in this deck is Tegrid, God of Fright. Since we are going to discard a lot of cards from our opponents, with Tegrid on the battlefield, we'll be getting all those permanents under our control. Let's take a quick peek at our little card draw. We only have 2 card draw cards in our deck, which is Tiny Bones, Trinket Thief, which says at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discarded a card this turn, we draw a card and lose a life. But we more have Tiny Bones in here for its second ability, since we want to go to a place where our opponents have 0 cards in hand. So we can use Tiny Bones ability for 2 black and 4, which says each opponent with no cards in hand loses 10 life. So this can quickly end games if we get to that point. And then the other card draw effect we have in here is Gets Grimoire, which is an artifact for 4 and says whenever an opponent discards a card from his or her hand, we may draw a card. Since all our opponents are going to discard plenty of cards every turn, this will just be insane card draw for us. The reason why there's not more card draw in here is because these 2 cards are the only cards in the deck that allow us individually to draw cards. There's going to be a group hug section next, which are cards that let everyone draw cards. So of course, a group hug commander deck cannot be a group hug commander deck without group hug effects. The group hug effects we have are Howling Mine for 2, and it says at the beginning of each player's draw step, if it's untapped, which it will be, the player draws an additional card. There you go, group hug. We have Master of the Feast. It's a 3 mana creature, 2 black and 1 colorless, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent draws a card. Since we want our opponents to draw cards, this card just gets even better because it's also a 5/5 flying body, which is just a big threat on 3 mana. Then we have Rites of Flourishing. It's an enchantment saying at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and each player may play an additional land on each of her turns. So this is straight up group hug. We have Font of Mythos. And it says, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws 2 additional cards. And Season Perverter of Truth. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses 2 life and draws 2 cards. So next up are the pingers. Since I've built this deck in a way where we're going to punish our opponents for drawing cards and for discarding cards, we need a lot of cards that will damage our opponents whenever they do either. So first up we have Bloodchief Ascension. Really powerful card once we get it online. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on Bloodchief Ascension. Since we're playing Commander and it's with 4 people, our 3 opponents will most likely hit each other, and this will get its counters pretty quickly. And then whenever a card is put into a graveyard from anywhere, if Bloodchief Ascension has 3 or more quest counters on it, which let's assume we have, you may have the player lose 2 life. If we do, then we gain 2 life. Next up is Cataract Parasite. It's a 1 black 1/1, and whenever an opponent draws a card, if we control a red permanent, you may have Redirect deal 1 damage to the player. Well, Winter, our commander, is of course also a red permanent, so assuming we have our commander, this will just ping all our opponents for 1 every time they draw a card. Then we have Liliana's Caress, which is an enchantment for black and 1, and whenever an opponent discards a card, they'll lose 2 life. Orcish Bowmasters, 1/1 with flash for a black and a colorless. Whenever it enters the battlefield and whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target. Then we amass Orcs 1. So this will trigger a lot, of course, since Winter lets our opponents draw cards in our turn, and we have a lot of the group hug effects which will allow our opponents to draw additional cards on their own turns. Then we have Razorkin Needlehead, has first strike during our turn, but that's not really too important. What's important is whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage to them. Then Stormfist Crusader, at the beginning of our upkeep, each player draws a card and loses a life. Megrim, whenever an opponent discards a card, it deals 2 damage to the player. Fate Unraveler, whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage to the player. Spellspectre, so this card has a little bit of both. It's not only a pinger, but it also makes our opponents discard cards. So yeah, whenever it enters, target opponent discard a card, and whenever an opponent discards a card, he loses 2 life. Rankle, Master of Pranks, Flying Haste, and whenever it deals combat damage, we can choose any number. So we always will let people discard a card, let everyone lose a life and draw a card, and probably also let everyone sacrifice a creature if we have something to sacrifice at least. Now, of course, in a deck which cares about pinging and cares about our opponents drawing a lot of cards, Sheoldred can be missed. It's a 4/5 death touch, and whenever I draw a card, we gain 2 life, and whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. So with Sheoldred on the battlefield, the game will be over pretty quickly. Next up is Spiteful Visions. It's an enchantment for 4, and at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. Whenever a player draws a card, Spiteful Vision deals 1 damage to the player. So this is also a card that has not only a ping ability, but also has the card draw ability for opponents. Last up is Obnixilis, Hey Twisted. We've included this because it's a planeswalker, and I didn't want to include just one planeswalker because we kind of want to get one of the planeswalkers into the graveyard eventually. So Decklist says whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage, so that goes great with our game plan. And then we can also destroy a creature and make them draw 2 cards, which in our deck is actually kind of great. So I've included Decklist as the second planeswalker in this deck. Now that we've seen the ways how we're gonna ping our opponents, and we've seen the group hug that we have, the effects that make our opponents draw cards, let's take a look at the cards that we use to make our opponents discard a lot of cards. First up is a land that we can use. We can tap 2 and then each player draws a card and discards a card. We have Burning Inquiry, sorcery for 1, and it says each player draws 3 and then discards 3 at random, which is also great because it's only 1 and 3 at random. You can hopefully make your opponent discard something very valuable this way. We have Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. It's a 6/6, and when it enters the battlefield, sacrifice unless it escapes. So ideally, of course, we want to play this for its escape cost. And whenever it attacks or enters, each opponent discards a card, and then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card loses 3 life. We have Turok Dread Cantor. Obviously, we kind of want to play this for its kicker cost. There's protection from white, which is a nice bonus. But whenever an opponent discards a card, put a 1/1 counter on Turok. When Turok enters, if it was kicked, target opponent discards 2 cards at random. Dark Deal. Each player discards all the cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards -1. We have Liliana of the Veil, which is the 3rd planeswalker in this deck and goes great with our deck because her +1 makes every player discard a card. And then for -2 we can sacrifice a creature, so it's also kind of a removal. But we don't mind if she dies because we at least will have a planeswalker in the graveyard. Next up is Mags of the Wheel. It's a wheel effect, so each player discards their entire hand, then draws 7 cards. And the fun thing with this is when Winter is online, even though they get to draw 7 cards, if they don't play out all 7 cards, depending on how many card types we have, in the best case scenario, they have 7 cards in hand, they play 1 or maybe 2 cards, and they have to discard another 5. And with the pingers we have, this can go very fast and take like 10 to maybe even 20 life each turn. We have Pain Magnification. It's an enchantment, and whenever an opponent is dealt 3 or more damage by a single source, that player discards a card. We don't necessarily have that many ways where we will do the 3 damage each turn, but since it's commander, our opponents will also try to attack each other. So this will go off quite often that way. Then we have Zursoth, Chaos Rider. It says that whenever an opponent draws their first card each turn, if it's not their turn, you create a 1/1 Red Devil creature token, and that creature token has, whenever it dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. And whenever one or more devils you control attack, 1 or more players, you and those players each draw a card, then discard a card. So not only does this trigger with our commander, so we make 1/1s on our turn, we also get to make tokens and then draw cards when we attack with the token, and discard in the same card. So this card is like an auto-include if you want to go this route. We have Siphon Mind. It's a sorcery, and each other player discards a card from his or her hand, then we draw a card for each card discarded this way. So assuming we have 3 opponents, we'd let them discard a card, we draw 3 for 4 mana. Seems pretty great. We have Aklazots. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing that right. But the Deepest Betrayal, it's a bad god, flying lifelink, and whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, we draw a card. So this again with Winter goes very well. In the worst case, they discard a card. In the best case, if they don't have any cards on hand anymore, we just get to draw a card. And then whenever an opponent discards a land card, we create a token with flying, and when it dies, it returns tapped and transformed under its owner's control, which is very easy for us to re-enable because the way we transform it back to being a creature is paying 3 and tapping it. But the thing is, we only get to do that if an opponent has 1 or fewer cards in hand, which with our deck happens pretty consistently, I must say. So yeah, you pretty much, as long as they don't exile this creature, you'll have it around pretty much permanently. Next up is Baylor. Flying Demon, and whenever he attacks or dies, choose 1 or more. Each mode must target a different player. Target opponent draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random. Target opponent sacrifices a non-artifact creature or a non-token artifact, and Baylor deals damage to target opponent equal to the number of cards in their hand. So 3rd mode probably won't be that great, but the 1st and the 2nd are definitely really good. Then we have Painful Quandary. No, it's a very easy way to deal damage. Whenever they cast a spell, the player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. The fun part about this is that if Winter is active, and we have 7, and so meaning our opponents have 0 hand size, when they draw their card for their turn, if they don't play it, then they have to discard it. So our opponents are kind of incentivized to just play the card they draw then. But if they do, then they don't have a card to discard, so they have to pay the 5 life. So it's kind of, you can put your opponents in a tough spot when you have the perfect scenario with this card. And last up we have Reforge the Soul. It's a sorcery for 5, which says each player discards his or her hand and draws 7 cards. But we can also cast it for a miracle cost if we draw it this turn and then cast it for 2, which is pretty cheap for this effect. Of course, we also need some ramp in this deck. We've got 9 ramp pieces in this deck, which are Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Farseek, Nature's Lore, Sakura Tribe Elder, 3 Visits, Kodama's Reach, Skyshroud Claim, and Solemn Simulacrum. We have a lot of sorceries and the Solemn Simulacrum in here because we need the card types in our graveyard. So, of course, all these sorceries will go straight to our graveyard once we cast them. And then we have Solemn Simulacrum, which is a artifact creature, so it counts as 2 types on its own. And since we let it die as soon as possible, we just chump it, we throw it for something, we get to end draw a card, and we instantly have 2 types in the graveyard. So this is just a really good card to enable the Delirium as fast as possible. The next section is the mill section. It's not really all mill, but I'll explain what I mean with this. Since we need the Delirium to be active as fast as possible, all these cards will at least help us to fill our graveyard with card types. Bloodstained Mire, it's a land that will sacrifice itself, so when we do, we instantly have a land in our graveyard. Commercial District is a surveil land, so when it enters, we get to surveil, and then if it's a good thing that we still need to have in our graveyard, we can just surveil it away into the graveyard and have an additional type in there. And we have Rakuya's Theater, it's another surveil land, same as Underground Mortuary, and then we have Fatalist Looting. Just an easy draw 2, discard 2, and it also has flashback, so we can cast it twice, and we can cast it the second time from the graveyard. We have Stitcher Supplier. It's a 1/1, but when it enters or dies, we put the top 3 cards from our library into our graveyard. So having this out at turn 1 and then dying maybe at turn 2 or 3 means 6 cards in your graveyard. This should easily enable Delirium at the very least, having just thus 4 card types in the graveyard, but it could be even more if we lock out, of course. Next up is Grisly Salvage. It's an instant for black and green, and it says reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature or land card from among them into your hands, put the rest into your graveyard. So 5 cards, we put 1 into our hands, means 4 cards hit the graveyard. Could easily get the Delirium with this card and then maybe 1 other card. Next up is Ripples of Undeath. It's an enchantment for black and colorless. And it says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards. Then you may pay 1 and 3 life if we do put that card in your hand. So the main reason why this is in here is because we just mill ourselves for 3 every turn, which is just an easy way to get to 7 card types in our graveyard. And then if we really have a card in the graveyard that we want to get back to our hand, we can just pay the 1 and 3 life and put it into our hand. We have Paragoyf. It's a Lurgoyf. I love that name or that creature type. It has Death Touch and Lifelink, and its power is equal to the number of card types we have in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to the number +1, and whenever it deals combat damage, we may mill that many cards. If we do, we may put a creature card from among them into our hand. So this is just a great card since it is Death Touch, so it'll kill pretty much everything. It has Lifelink to keep us healthy. It will be really big since we get a lot of card types in our graveyard fast, because we need it for Delirium, and then if we still need a few card types in our graveyard, we can choose to mill, but we don't have to. So in the late game, we can choose not to mill, because of course we don't want to mill ourselves out in this deck. And then next we have Grist, the Hunger Tide. So Grist is a really good include here because, as you may notice, it's a Planeswalker, and there are not that many Planeswalkers compared to creatures, but this Planeswalker specifically has a very good first line of text, which is, as long as Grist isn't on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. So again, this card, if it hits your graveyard, it unlocks Planeswalker and creature as a type in your graveyard. And then also for the +1, we can do a little bit of milling, make some tokens. We can sacrifice the token, then maybe next turn with a -2 and destroy a creature. But we really don't care if this dies. It's just a good card to have in graveyard. And lastly, we have 6. It's a 2/4 with reach for a green and 2 colorless, and it says whenever it attacks, we mill 3, and then we may put a land card from among them into our hand. And then as long as it's our turn, non-land permanent cards in your graveyard have retrace. So retrace is also great since we will be milling quite a bit. With this way, we can just discard a card, or a land card I mean, and then pay the other cost of the cards from in our graveyard and just play them. So it's kind of good recursion as well. And since Winter allows us to draw 2 extra cards every upkeep, we really don't have a problem hitting our land drops once we're in the mid game. So discarding a land really doesn't bother us anymore. Next up, we have some recursion. I don't have a lot of recursion in this deck, even though you definitely could put a lot of it in. The reason why I didn't put a lot of it in is we already have Tegrid, and also I really wanted to make this deck about the pinging. Instead of just reanimating everything that is being discarded all the time with like a bunch of cards. So we have a few and a really good one in Tegrid, but we also run reanimates. So it's just for 1, and we put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control, and we lose life equal to its mana value. We've animated that, so we can enchant a creature card in a graveyard and it will enter the battlefield. It gets -1, but it doesn't really bother us. We will most likely just pick something with a good static effect or an ETB or whatever. And then last up we have Chainer, Nightmare Adept. This is more for our own graveyard since what we can do, since we have a lot of card draw ourselves just in Winter itself and in the other cards we have that are Group Hug, we don't mind discarding cards ourselves as well. And then whenever we do, we may cast a creature spell from our graveyard this turn and activate it only once each turn, which is just fine. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if we didn't cast it from our hand, it gains haste. So it's just a really good card because we can just keep playing stuff from our graveyard when it dies, and yeah, just a really good tool. Of course, we also want to keep Winter alive. Since Winter already has War 2 from itself, we don't have that many ways to really protect her, because I just wanted to have more other spells in the deck instead of more protection. But we do have Kaya's Ghost Form, since Winter's already a hard target because of the ward. Whenever our opponents decide to destroy him or exile him, which is what I really like about this card, we can just return it under our control. So with this card on your commander, don't expect your opponents to really go for it, because first they have to pay the ward 2, which will slow them down, and then it just also comes back. So the only thing that really happens when we have Kaya's Ghost Form out on the battlefield is probably a board wipe, and then we just get our commander back. So it's just amazing. We have Malakir Rebirth, which is an instant. We can hold up 1 black, and then whenever Winter is being killed, we can snipe this one in, choose Winter, lose 2 life, and then what it says, whenever it dies, we just return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. And last up, we have Tamio's Safekeeping. It's also an instant, so whenever someone targets our Winter to kill it, we can just give it hexproof, and if it's a board wipe, it also gets indestructible, and we gain 2 life. And all these cards are just 1 mana, so the protection is very easy to keep up, because we just have to keep up 1 land every time. Now, of course, we also need ways to slow down our opponents and remove important pieces from their board. The removal we have in this deck are Assassin's Trophy. It's destroy a target permanent an opponent controls, and then enemy search their library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield. So technically it's also Group Hug, because we'll give them an extra land. Untimely Malfunction, it's a card with a lot of options. We can destroy an artifact if we want to, but what I like more is changing the target of a spell. So whenever someone targets something that bothers us, we can just change the target with this card. And this third option, we really don't want to use that at all, actually, because we're not really about swinging out. Then we have Beast Within, Chaos Warp, we have the Roller Crusher Ride. Technically you could see this as a board wipe as well, but you'll have to sink in a lot of mana to kill multiple things. But it's a good card for like killing maybe 1, 2 or 3 creatures. And it also has Delirium, which is nice, which also does something for us. If a source would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player, it deals double the damage. So all our pingers will ping for double as long as we have Delirium and have this card on the battlefield. And last but not least, we have Drag to the Roots, which is a new card from Duskmourn as well, with Delirium. And since we'll have Delirium very easily, this will basically always be a black-green to destroy a non-land permanent. Then next to the single target removal, we also have 2 board wipes in this deck. I don't really like running board wipes in a lot of my decks, but we do have a few of them, since if the board state really gets that bad, then we need to have a way to reset it. So we have Toxic Deluge and we have Blasphemous Act. So that sums up the deck, guys. I really like how Winter, how they printed this card. And I'm having a lot of fun playing this card in my group, because you just make everyone at the table rethink their life choices, basically. Once you've got your Delirium going, you've got some good pingers, you've got some effects that punish in the form of whenever they cast a spell it get punished, or whenever they draw cards they get punished, or whenever they discard a card they get punished. Just every action they make, they'll have to think twice, think 3 times about what to do, and we're just sitting there and having a lot of fun. I hope you guys have all enjoyed it. If you have, please make sure to subscribe, like, and comment, because you'll help us a lot with that. And if you think we haven't deserved it yet, then I'll make sure that we have in the next video, because we'll work twice as hard for you. And yeah, we're gonna see you in the next one. Bye!